The hum of the car's engine was the only sound breaking the quiet of Oak Ridge Avenue. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield, its rhythm steady and almost soothing. James Carter, a seasoned FBI agent with years of high-pressure missions under his belt, tightened his grip on the steering wheel. This wasn't just another assignment, it was personal. His mind churned with thoughts of what he had uncovered over the past months, a web of criminal activity. So intricate and far-reaching. It felt like a beast with countless heads. Illegal arms trafficking, money laundering, and an unholy alliance with law enforcement and political figures, all tied to one name, Vincent Kane. James wore a simple gray hoodie and a pair of faded jeans, blending in with the quiet affluence of the neighborhood. His car, an unassuming sedan, seemed out of place among the luxury SUVs and sports cars parked along the manicured driveways. But this was exactly how James operated, under the radar, invisible to those who didn't know where to look. Tonight had been a calculated risk. He had just met a low-level informant inside a dimly lit cafe on the edge of the city. The man had provided him with a crucial piece of intelligence: the time and location of an impending arms deal orchestrated by Kane's network. It was the break James needed, a sliver of clarity in an otherwise murky case. But the ease of the meeting gnawed at him. Informants rarely offered information without strings attached, and this one had been unusually eager. It felt too easy, like bait dangling from a hook. Glancing at his rearview mirror, James caught a glimpse of his own reflection. His sharp, dark eyes were shadowed with unease, his face framed by the dim glow of the dashboard. He had seen this look before, in moments where the stakes were life or death, when his instincts warned him that something wasn't right. Tonight was one of those moments. As he approached the junction leading to the main highway, the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him out of his thoughts. A police cruiser loomed behind him, its siren piercing the stillness of the rainy night. James's chest tightened. "Not now," he muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. Routine traffic stops weren't routine for him. Over the years, James had developed a healthy mistrust of law enforcement, especially in cases involving corruption, and this case was teeming with it. His heart thumped as he weighed his options. He reached for the glove compartment, where his FBI badge rested, a shield of authority he had relied on countless times. But even as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, he hesitated. He had been stopped before in neighborhoods like this. Being a black man driving an average car through wealthy streets often raised suspicion, regardless of his credentials. The rain intensified as two officers approached his window, their silhouettes blurred by the streaks of water on the glass. James rolled down the window, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His training kicked in. Remain calm. Don't escalate. Assess every detail. "Good evening, officer," James said, his voice measured. "Is there a problem?" The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, loomed closer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. His partner, Officer Grayson, hung back slightly, his gaze cold and calculating. Daniels didn't bother with pleasantries. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. James nodded, reaching carefully for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license along with his FBI badge, his movements deliberate. Daniels took the badge, scrutinized it for a moment, then sneered. "FBI, huh," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. He glanced at Grayson, who smirked in response. "You really expect us to believe that?" James held his composure, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "If you'd like, I can call my supervisor to verify," he offered, keeping his voice neutral. Daniels ignored the suggestion. Leaning closer, "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his fingers inching toward his gun. James hesitated for a split second, weighing the situation. These men weren't interested in protocol or verification. They had already made up their minds. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the rain, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "You're making a mistake," James said, his tone firm but restrained. His eyes locked onto Daniels's, searching for any flicker of reason. But Daniels wasn't listening. He motioned to Grayson, who stepped forward with handcuffs at the ready. "Turn around. Hands behind your back," Daniels barked. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into James's wrists, a sharp reminder of how quickly power could be abused. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. Every part of this interaction felt wrong, calculated. As Grayson tightened the cuffs, James glanced at him, hoping for even a glimmer of doubt or hesitation. But all he saw was a smirk of satisfaction. Daniel shoved him toward the squad car with unnecessary force. James stumbled slightly, but kept his balance. His mind raced. Was this a random stop? Or had Kane's network already infiltrated deeper than he'd anticipated? The question burned in his thoughts as Daniels opened the back door and pushed him inside. As the squad car pulled away from the curb, James realized they weren't heading toward the police station. The route they were taking was unfamiliar, winding away from the main roads and into the shadows of Oak Ridge's outskirts. His unease deepened, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary arrest. He leaned forward, speaking through the metal grate separating him from the front seats. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded. Daniels didn't answer at first, his focus on the road. Then, without turning around, he sneered, "Don't worry about it. You'll get your answers soon enough." James's stomach churned. He had seen enough in his career to know what that meant. This wasn't an arrest. It was an abduction. As the rain continued to pound against the car, James's mind raced, formulating a plan. He had survived worse. He had outmaneuvered enemies more dangerous than these two men. But this time, the stakes felt higher. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting to protect the critical information he carried. And he wasn't about to let them win. The rhythmic wipers of the squad car swished back and forth, barely keeping pace with the relentless rain. James Carter sat in the back seat, his mind racing even as his body remained perfectly still. Years of training had taught him the importance of outward calm in moments of crisis. His wrists burned where the handcuffs dug into his skin, but he ignored the pain. Pain could wait. What mattered now was understanding who he was up against and what they wanted. The squad car sped through Oak Ridge Avenue, leaving behind the polished facades of the affluent neighborhood. It veered onto a narrow road, surrounded by shadows and dense trees. James's gut tightened as he realized this wasn't a route to any precinct or holding facility. They were heading somewhere isolated. "Where are you taking me?" James repeated, his voice steady but with an edge of authority. Officer Daniels glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You'll find out soon enough." His tone was casual, almost amused, as if he enjoyed James's discomfort. Officer Grayson, sitting in the passenger seat, turned slightly to look back at James. "It's funny, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and taunting. "How the mighty FBI can end up in the back of a squad car, just like anyone else." James didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he studied the men carefully. Daniels, the leader, exuded arrogance and control, his demeanor suggesting he was used to getting what he wanted. Grayson, on the other hand, was quieter, his eyes sharp and calculating. Together, they were dangerous, but James knew they weren't the real threat. They were pawns, tools of someone far more powerful. The rain-soaked road gave way to a crumbling path, and soon the car pulled into the overgrown lot of Ravenwood Industrial Park. The dilapidated buildings stood like skeletal remnants of a forgotten era, their rusted frames silhouetted against the gray sky. The air here was heavy, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made every sound feel amplified. The car came to a stop, and Daniels stepped out, slamming his door with a force that made the car shudder. Grayson followed suit, opening the back door and yanking James out by the arm. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and James's shoes sank slightly as he was pulled forward. "Move!" Daniels barked, shoving him toward one of the larger buildings. Its windows were broken, and the faint stench of mildew and decay wafted from its gaping doorway. James scanned his surroundings as they walked. Abandoned vehicles and rusted equipment littered the lot, creating a maze of potential hiding spots and escape routes. He filed away every detail, his mind already working on contingencies. Survival was a game of preparation. And James never stepped onto a battlefield unarmed, even if his only weapon now was his wits. Inside the building, the air was damp and cold, every step echoing on the cracked concrete floor. Daniels led him to a small room that might have once been an office. A single chair sat in the center, surrounded by shadows. Grayson shoved James into the chair, his hands lingering on the cuffs as if daring him to resist. Daniels lit a cigarette, the glow from its tip briefly illuminating his face. He exhaled a plume of smoke, leaning casually against the wall. "All right, Agent Carter," he began, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's cut to the chase. You've been sniffing around where you shouldn't, and certain people aren't happy about it." James met his gaze, his own eyes cold and unyielding. "If you're trying to intimidate me, you'll have to do better than this." Daniels chuckled, flicking ash onto the floor. "Oh, I like you. You got guts, but guts won't save you." He nodded toward Grayson, who pulled out a phone and began typing a message. For the first time, James felt a flicker of alarm. If they were contacting someone, it meant this wasn't an improvised operation. These men had a plan, and James was the centerpiece. His mind flashed to Vincent Kane, the shadowy figure at the heart of the criminal network he'd been chasing. Kane was ruthless and cunning, the kind of man who could corrupt law enforcement and political systems with ease. If these officers were working for him, James's situation had just gone from bad to worse. "Let me guess," James said, his tone sharp. "Kane sent you. Or are you just two-bit thugs hoping to earn his favor?" Danielle's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Careful, Agent," he warned. "You don't want to make this harder on yourself." James leaned back in the chair, his expression defiant. "If Kane thinks he can scare me, he doesn't know who he's dealing with." The tension in the room thickened. But James noticed something subtle. Grayson's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second on his phone. It was a small tell, but it gave James a sliver of insight. Grayson wasn't as confident as he pretended to be. Daniels might be the enforcer, but Grayson was the weak link. "Here's the thing, Daniels," James continued, his voice calm but cutting. "Men like Kane always overplay their hand. They think they're untouchable, but they make mistakes. And when they do, men like me bring them down." Daniels stepped closer, the cigarette dangling precariously from his lips. "Big talk for someone in cuffs," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you're not in a position to make threats." James held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Neither are you." The moment hung in the air, heavy and charged. Danielle's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Grayson's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "We've got a problem," he muttered, showing the screen to Daniels. Daniels cursed under his breath, his composure slipping for the first time. He turned to James, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like your friends at the Bureau are quicker than we thought," he said. "But don't worry, we've got time to finish what we started." James's mind raced. If the FBI was on to them, his window of opportunity was shrinking. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. He shifted in the chair, testing the strength of the cuffs again. They were tight, but not unbreakable. All he needed was a distraction. Daniels turned to Grayson. "Get the car ready. We're moving him." Grayson hesitated, his uncertainty evident. It was all James needed. As Grayson stepped toward the door, James lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into Daniels. The move caught both men off guard, sending Daniels sprawling onto the floor. Grayson turned, but James was already on his feet, the chair clattering to the ground behind him. The cuffs might have slowed him, but they didn't stop him. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this, when everything came down to a split-second decision. And James Carter never hesitated. James Carter's heart pounded as the chair clattered to the floor. Daniels, momentarily stunned, scrambled to his feet, his hand reaching for his sidearm. Grayson froze in the doorway, his hesitation betraying a lack of experience in dealing with someone like James. It was the moment James had been waiting for. With his wrists still cuffed, James moved fast, closing the gap between himself and Daniels. He swung his body into Daniels with all his weight, knocking the officer back against the wall. The impact forced Daniels to drop his weapon, and it clattered loudly onto the cracked concrete floor. James's movements were calculated and fluid, the result of years of intense FBI training. He grabbed the fallen gun with his bound hands and turned to face Grayson. "Don't even think about it," James barked, leveling the weapon at Grayson. Grayson raised his hands slowly, his eyes darting between James and Daniels, who groaned as he tried to recover. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly, and James wasn't about to let it slip. "Keys," James ordered, jerking his chin toward Grayson's belt. "Now!" Grayson fumbled with trembling hands, unhooking the keyring from his belt and tossing it to James. The agent caught it deftly and freed his wrists, the cuffs falling to the floor with a dull clang. Rubbing his sore wrists, he stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the two officers. "You thought you could control me," James said, his voice low and steely. "But you underestimated who you were dealing with." Daniel spat out a curse as he clutched his ribs, his glare burning with anger. "You think this changes anything? Kane's gonna find you. Carter, you're a dead man walking." James smirked. "You tell Kane he picked the wrong man to mess with." Without another word, James moved quickly out of the room, the gun still in his grip. He didn't trust Grayson and Daniels to stay down for long, so he needed to act fast. The building's layout was a maze of decaying walls and darkened corridors. But James's sharp instincts guided him. He found an exit near the rear of the structure, the rain still pouring outside, masking his movements as he slipped into the night. The lot was eerily quiet, the sound of rain on metal the only noise. James scanned his surroundings, searching for a vehicle he could use to escape. Spotting an old pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot, he sprinted toward it. His pulse quickened as he reached the driver's side door and yanked it open. The keys were still in the ignition, a careless oversight he silently thanked. The engine roared to life, and James wasted no time putting the truck in gear. As he drove away from Ravenwood Industrial Park, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by the sharp clarity of purpose. He needed to get the information he had gathered to the Bureau. Kane's network was deeper than he had imagined, and tonight's events proved just how dangerous the stakes had become. As the truck sped onto the main road, James's mind replayed the details of the encounter. Daniels and Grayson weren't just corrupt, they were Kane's enforcers, tasked with eliminating threats to the operation. But their arrogance had given James a critical advantage, the knowledge that Kane was watching him closely. It wasn't just an investigation anymore, it was personal. For both sides, the familiar skyline of the city came into view, the distant glow of streetlights cutting through the rain. James tightened his grip on the wheel. He had always known his work carried risks, but tonight had pushed him to the edge. Still, he wasn't deterred. Kane's network was powerful, but James had something they couldn't counter: unrelenting determination. By the time he reached the secure FBI field office, dawn was breaking. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sky painted in muted shades of gray and orange. James walked into the building, his clothes soaked and his face set with grim resolve. His supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Agent Harper, met him at the door. "Carter," she said, her sharp eyes scanning him. "We've been trying to reach you." "What happened?" "Long story," James replied, handing her a USB drive he had hidden during the encounter. "But I've got what we need. Kane's network goes deeper than we thought, and he's already made his move." Harper took the drive, her expression hardening. "We'll debrief later. Right now, we need to move. If Kane knows we're onto him, he won't wait to strike." James nodded, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. But as he stood in the brightly lit office, surrounded by his team, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but he wasn't fighting alone. Together, they would dismantle Kane's empire piece by piece, no matter how long it took. As James walked toward the operations room, his thoughts lingered on Daniels and Grayson. Corruption like theirs thrived in shadows. But James had spent his career bringing light to the darkest places. He wasn't just fighting for justice, He was fighting for a system that couldn't be swayed by power or fear. The rain outside had stopped, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the clouds. For James, it was a reminder that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn.